A lot of people will, when they come out of flow, they don't go into recovery. They don't do anything to replenish. And then they wonder why they can't get themselves back into a state of flow later. It's because you've got nothing left. You wouldn't go run a marathon, like go jog that night and then get up the next day and think you can run again. You know that you need to recover and take care of your body. It's the same thing with your brain.
Dr. Melanie, we are thrilled to have you with us on the show today. And this has been a conversation that's kind of been in the background of our minds as we've developed this show. And we know that burnout is the topic that we all feel, whether it's right now or if you reflect on your career chapter. All of us can relate to moments, periods of time where we would identify with the word burnout. And you are a brain coach. You help executives reach their potential. I'm thrilled to have you and just want to say thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to get to speak with you guys about this topic because it is very, very important and something that is often overlooked.
So, Dr. Melanie, let's level set, start there. If you would, give us a definition of burnout and maybe explain the signs and the symptoms a little bit.
So Christina Masloch is like one of the lead researchers around burnout. And so first of all, if anybody's ever interested in taking your own self-assessment, you can just Google the Masloch burnout inventory and you can find it for free. And you can take that inventory to kind of see how you score. But essentially burnout is made up of 3 different areas. So it's exhaustion, which can be emotional exhaustion or physical. So it's just like feeling that drain all the time. Cynicism, so not really seeing the point of your work, not caring about what you do, and then a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. So feeling like you're just not getting anywhere. And with clinical burnout, it's where these symptoms are pretty consistent. They don't really fluctuate. So you're going to see them, across the board on a day-to-day basis. It's not going to be based on one particular project or one particular circumstance.
What is actually happening more at, I guess, a neurological side or brain body? What are we going through when we're experiencing this?
With what they've actually found in doing brain scans when people have clinical burnout or people are experiencing it, is it actually affects the brain structures. They have found that it affects the amygdala and it affects the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala is an area that really helps us to regulate emotions. It helps with memory. The prefrontal cortex is where we work on organization and prioritization and time management. So when these structures are affected, where the amygdala, it actually becomes bigger. And then the prefrontal cortex, there's a reduction in volume and gray matter. And so what this will look like is, people feel like they have to exert more mental energy to problem solve. They feel like they have a really hard time managing emotions, specifically negative emotions. So they may find themselves really irritable or blowing up or road rage, if that's not typical for them. And then they may find that they feel scattered all the time, where they're just constantly all over the place.
So interesting to hear that description. And again, as I said, it's whether whoever is watching is experiencing that now, I'm sure as you reflect on your life and career journey, there's been moments. And what's interesting to me about burnout, we've established it's the enemy, but we often arrive at burnout because we're putting tons of energy and effort into something that we care about a lot, professionally or personally. And so what does it look like to make shifts to be able to put a lot of energy and effort and enthusiasm towards something in a healthy way that doesn't lead to a state of burnout?
If we can really design our work time, our work day around optimal, peak performance. So if we know when we tend to be most alert, when we tend to be most focused, and then we have some control in how we schedule our day, so we can put, certain projects or things that require a lot of creativity or attention during those during those specific times, that can help a lot. If things are just kind of assigned to us, if we have no say in our schedule, it can be harder because then we may find that we have to attend a meeting at a time of day where our brain just isn't ready for it, or it's not at like peak alertness. And then we leave that event feeling really drained or really exhausted or tired. So we can really get the most out of our day by maximizing that potential and understanding, where we benefit the most or where we are most focused. And then also it can be really helpful to understand the flow phases and the flow cycle so that we can actually put ourselves into a state of flow at the time of day where we are at our peak potential or our peak performance level. And so knowing about like the phases of flow and what they look like, and then being able to understand like, okay, I'm in the struggle phase. So now I know what I need to do to move through release so I can get into flow. I know I need to go into recovery, but understanding those cycles can make a big difference too.
I always heard, and I like the expression, be a maker in the morning and a manager in the afternoon. I mean, like, all the creative stuff, get that done in the morning and do tasks later, maybe when your brain's a little burned out. That seems to work pretty well for me, but I can understand just hearing you talk that what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another person. Everyone's got different rhythms, right? But we can all relate to this idea of struggle, like being in the struggle phase and wanting to get into the flow state. What are some things? What are some steps? Like if you feel stuck, what's something you can do to push forward?
So most people operate from the struggle phase. So it's the first phase of the flow cycle. I actually wrote an entire book in the struggle phase. We can get stuff
You mean
done.
you wrote about the struggle phase, or you were in the struggle phase while you were writing the book?
I was in the struggle phase for the entire book.
Okay, wow. So when you read it now, can you identify that in the writing?
I don't identify it in the writing, but I identify it in how I feel about the book, because it was not easy for me to write.
Ah,
It wasn't
interesting.
fun. Whereas another book where I wrote, once I learned about flow and I understood how to trigger it and how to get myself into it, that book was a completely different story. And I wrote it only in the flow phase. And that book, now looking back,
Oh,
like, I love that book. It's like, I am so enthusiastic about it. When we're in that struggle phase, like we can get a lot of work done. We can write books, we can do things, we can, finish all our projects, but it might not be very fun for us. It might not be very efficient, and it might lead to burnout if we constantly are in that struggle phase. So we want to make sure to pull ourselves out of it by having some unstimulating breaks, like cognitively unstimulating breaks, where maybe we eat or drink without doing anything else, go for a walk, we do some stretching, might take a shower. But these are things that can actually cause us to then go into the release phase and then into flow. That can move us out of struggle.
I want to get into flow. So, okay, this is fun. I mean, these are all things that make a lot of sense. Is it just experimenting with some of those tactics you just shared and seeing what kind of works for you, or do you feel like there's three things that everyone can do and they'll all get the same results?
First of all, recognizing when you're in that struggle phase. So when you are in it and it's really itchy and squirmy, when we are in struggle phase, that's when our brain is releasing cortisol. Our prefrontal cortex is very active. We're going to want to start a conversation with a colleague about last night's game, or we're going to want to scroll on Instagram. We're going to want to check our email because it's just like itchy. We want to get out of it. If we can recognize that, okay, I'm in the struggle phase and I need to just see this through, and I can take a walk or do some stretching or go take a shower, and I can move myself into that release phase, I'll be able to go right into flow. And so we can actually, by understanding how it feels and staying in that discomfort, we can allow ourselves to get into that release phase. But yeah, the release phase, research shows that it needs to be cognitively unstimulating breaks. That's what's going to help us move through release and into flow. You don't want to read a book. You don't want to start a conversation with somebody. You don't want to scroll. You want to make sure that you're just doing something that isn't, you could even sit and stare at a blank wall. That can actually help move you through it too.
So interesting. I'm reflecting as you're talking on the fact that a lot of us actually live our lives in that struggle phase almost, where without understanding the way that the brain works and then the way that these tools and these habits more so can move us from struggle and into release and then into flow. Without understanding those, it is just the nature of our life as well, where it's perpetual distractions and we're actually just going from one distraction to the next rather than pushing through in this intentional way to get to that deeper flow state. So I wanted to just give that feedback. I've been working with you for 6 months now, and it's been so powerful personally to be able to understand the difference even between these phases and be able to pause and say, okay, wait, I think I'm trying to do this deep thinking, but I'm actually just stuck over here in this struggle phase. And even eliminating distractions and kind of knowing what my tendencies are, being aware of just the functionality of the brain, all of this stuff has helped so much to empower me more so to be able to know what I need to do. What is the formula when I want to go into that deeper thinking place and ultimately get the best out of myself, get the best out of my potential, right? I find it interesting as well. I want to give a feedback point that has been an unlock for me about understanding that our brains are meant to create in short, intense, focused bursts, where that might seem intuitive, but actually the way we often treat our brains is like a library where it's just shoving in tons of information that just sits up on the shelf, where we're not actually like pulling it off the shelf, interacting with it, creating, and then cleaning house, kind of organizing it. And so that process that you're explaining allows us to create in those short, intense, focused bursts within flow state in a way that feels actually more easy and fun in some way.
This episode of Listen Loudly is brought to you by Door Number 3, a growth marketing firm for challenger brands. Door Number 3 works with scale-up and enterprise-level brands who have a mandate to grow. We help them shift from accidental to intentional growth through performance media and brand development. If you need a growth strategy and execution partner, visit dn3austin.com or give us a call. We look forward to talking to you.
I wanted to ask a specific question about what's the easiest way to get knocked out of flow. So you've done all this work to actually push yourself into flow state. What kicks you out of it?
The easiest thing would be to, pick up your phone and check social media or check email. That's what most people do. And that is literally going to just pull you right out of flow because it reactivates your prefrontal cortex. So when we're in a state of flow, like endorphins are being released, dopamine's being released, our prefrontal cortex is deactivated. So everything is like really efficient and quick, and we are more creative. We're able to think more clearly. If you check your phone, you are activating your prefrontal cortex. You are immediately pulling yourself out of it. So anything that's going to activate your prefrontal cortex, like reading an email, starting a conversation with somebody, being interrupted, you could have a colleague come into your office and that could be something that pulls you out. Or it could be, if you're working from home and kids come into the office. So like interruptions and distractions will pull you out as well.
Can you have too much of a good thing? Like, is there any risk or downside to having too much flow?
There is. It's funny because for those of you who are familiar with mental health issues and mental health disorders, you might know of bipolar and you might have heard of mania and like manic episodes. Well, flow is very similar to mania. When we are in a state of flow and we make that rapid decision, those rapid decisions, we're really creative. We have all kinds of ideas. The downside is when we come out of flow, we may realize that some of our ideas that we thought were brilliant actually really don't make that much sense. Or our timeline is way off because when we're in a state of flow, time moves really quickly. So we think that everything's going to move that fast. Or I just came up with this idea and oh my gosh, this is only going to take me 2 hours to complete, but not accounting for the fact that I may actually end up working on that project when I am out of flow and it's going to take a lot longer, or I'm not thinking of all of the nuances that go into the project. So we can be very grandiose. We underestimate how long things will take. We think things should be really easy. And then we get frustrated when they're not. And then even for like athletes, their risk tolerance is a lot higher when they're in flow. And so when they're not in flow, they may find that they make riskier decisions that they can't follow through on. And so I've seen that with some of the athletes I've worked with, where they get into a state of flow during a competition and they're able to complete certain tricks. And then when they're practicing, they feel like they can still complete those tricks, but they can't because they're practicing and they can't get into a state of flow during practice because there's lots of interruptions and other things going on. And then they end up injuring themselves.
So interesting. And I want to come back to zoom in a little bit more on the concept of the fact that we all have better energy at certain times of the day and it varies from person to person. Tell me about the concept of chronotypes and the way that you can kind of self-evaluate which one you are and therefore, build your schedule around that.
So Daniel Pink has done a lot of writing and a lot of research on chronotypes. So if anybody, I don't know if either of you have read his book, When. If not, I highly recommend it. You'll never want to go to the doctor after 9 a.m. again. And it's really about when we are in tune with our own natural biorhythms. The way he breaks it down is you want to consider your ideal bedtime and wake time. So not what you have to do for work or for kids, but if you could choose what time you went to bed and what time you wake up, and then you take the midpoint between the two, and then that's going to determine what your chronotype is. So for me, my ideal bedtime is 10. My ideal wake time is 6 a.m. So the midpoint between the two is 2 a.m. So that makes me a lark, because anything between 12 a.m. and 3:30 is a lark. Between 3:30 and 5:30 is what's called a third bird. And then I think it's like 5:30 to noon is an owl. And so if you are a lark or a third bird, then you are going to be most alert earlier in the day versus an owl who they're going to have their peak alertness like late in the afternoon, early evening.
I'm definitely not an owl, but I think I'm married to one. So that keeps things interesting. I'm definitely a lark. I'm with you, but that's a cool. I've not heard those terms before. That was very helpful. So thinking about people that are tuned into this, a lot of them are in the creative field. Marketing, so any kind of marketing has creativity to it, but you also have to have the business savvy. So you have to be empathetically engaged with your audience, I would say. So does having to use all these different muscles put you at a greater risk of burnout? I mean, it's the idea of having to shift gears all the time. Something we talk about, but it's a reality in our business.
So I would say it's not so much about having to use different muscles, but it's more about having a task switch. So task switching is a flow blocker. Because if you are going from something creative to a spreadsheet, you're not going to be able to get into focused work for either of those things. So you're going to be in that struggle phase for both of them, and it's going to take you a lot longer. So it's more about like the task switching. If you're able to, stick with one project through completion, or at least whatever the goal is that you set for that day, to get as far as you want on that particular project. And then once you've reached that goal, then you switch over to the spreadsheet. That's going to be much more helpful for you. But if you're constantly task switching, or if your work culture expects you to, always be available to respond to, pings on Slack, then you're never going to be able to get into that creative headspace. You're never going to be able to get into that deep work. And then you're going to feel like you're not making any progress at work. So you're not getting that like personal sense of accomplishment. You're more likely to feel exhausted, and that's going to lead to burnout.
Yeah, it's a constant struggle. I think we could all get better at that, but time blocking is really important. It's a balance of time blocking in allowing for that deep flow state, but then also recognizing that you can't go off the grid for 3 hours and not get back to your manager or your boss or something. So the struggle is real, but I think what you're bringing up is really important. We could all improve there.
Yeah, I did a workshop recently for a PR firm on flow and like teaching them all about it and how to incorporate it at work. And one solution that they had is they created a notification in Slack where they could mark when they're in flow. And so then if they put themselves in flow, everybody knew not to go by their office, not to bother them, not to expect an immediate response. And they made it so that they could block out flow blocks on their schedule, and nobody was going to schedule meetings during that time. And so that was their solution to that issue. And I was checking in with the CEO the other day to see how it was going. And she's like, it's wonderful. People are getting so much more work done. They feel more engaged because they're able to do that deep focused work on things. And they know that that time is protected. They don't have to worry that they're going to get in trouble or anything like that. So it's like figuring out what works best in your culture.
I love that. That's great advice. We have something at door number 3 called No Talk Tuesdays, which just sounds completely antisocial. But the idea is no meetings on Tuesdays. Like it's your chance to do deep work. And so I think your version of that at your company, your workplace is imperative.
Exactly.
Yeah. So moving through this 4-phased cycle that you've been speaking about, the phase about active recovery, which follows flow state, talk to us about the role that active recovery plays in this process and making sure that following flow state, active recovery is prioritized so that tomorrow, when you try to enter flow state again, your brain is clear, you're showing up with a mind that's ready to get back into flow state.
Yes. So the recovery phase is when we are replenishing all the neurochemicals that we burn through during the state of flow, because we really do exhaust ourselves during flow. And so it's really important that we replenish the neurochemicals, but then also it's a checks and balances opportunity. So it's that, time to see, do my ideas make sense? Did the schedule I create, does that make sense? So we want to have a recovery period where we are really focused on expanding our capacity and replenishing. So active recovery is not relaxation. A lot of people will think of recovery as watching TV or gaming or drinking alcohol, and that's relaxation, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not recovery. You're not going to replenish like serotonin and some of the other things that you need. So active recovery is going to be things like nature immersion, cold water plunges, saunas, intense exercise, meditation, breath work. Those are all things that when you come out of flow, if you schedule some time to do that, now you've replenished those neurochemicals. And then it's, the next time you go through struggle, you're now ready to actually handle the struggle phase and to go back into flow because you've replenished them. If a lot of people will, when they come out of flow, they don't go into recovery, they don't do anything to replenish, and then they wonder why they can't get themselves back into a state of flow later. It's because you've got nothing left. You wouldn't go run a marathon and then get up, like go jog that night and then get up the next day and think you can run again. You know that you need to recover and take care of your body. It's the same thing with your brain.
Dr. Melanie, what about sleep's role in recovery?
So sleep is essential for just recovery, repair. Our brains need it because this is when neural networks are forming, that's where learning occurs. It's where our brain is editing information and it's kind of like moving it around and putting it in the appropriate spots. So we really need to make sure that we're getting enough sleep to be able to get back into flow the next time we want to. Most adults need between 7 and 8 hours of sleep, which means you actually want to be in bed between 8 and 9 hours of sleep, or 8 or 9 hours of time. Because if you have to get up at 6 a.m. and you need 8 hours, you don't want to be in bed at 10. You want to be in bed at night because you're not going to just like fall asleep the second your head hits a pillow. You want to account for like that time or waking during the night and things like that.
So one nuance about flow state is a concept of group flow. Like how can a team get into a flow state together? For example, we had an offsite last week. We had all of our team from across the country come in, and we were super intentional about our schedule and the way that we think together and move together. But I'm curious what you would say. What are some ways that we could, even hindsight, have structured that offsite to make sure that we're all moving into flow state together and getting the most out of that time?
Yes. So absolutely, you can get into group flow together as long as certain criteria is met. So you want to make sure that the group, first of all, is like familiar with each other. There needs to be some comfort with one another. It needs to be a safe space where people feel like they can communicate openly. They're not going to be reprimanded, or there's not going to be consequences if they share certain things. You want there to be shared goals where everybody's kind of working towards the same thing and kind of has like a shared purpose. as well as shared risk. So everyone kind of has the same amount of skin in the game. It's not like one person is the one who's like putting themselves out on the line, because then it's harder for everyone else to kind of get into that state of flow. And then also you want it to be an environment where everyone's going to be like in full concentration mode. So that means like people aren't pulling out their phones. Like that is such a group flow blocker. If somebody's checking their phone or they're getting alerts and notifications, like, you know what that's like. You're in the middle of a conversation with someone and they pull out their phone and look at it. That's like a total conversation killer. That's also a group flow blocker. So you don't want to have people checking emails or doing other things. And then you don't want there to be interruptions. So you want to make sure that the environment is one where other people aren't going to be coming into it constantly. Like if you had it at a restaurant where like the waiter's constantly coming to the table, that would make it trickier.
Interesting.
That is so helpful.
It is helpful. And what about even the kind of the pre-work, like the homework to set expectations for the time? I'm curious at what you might say as far as how to tell the team, here's our objective and here's how I need you to prepare accordingly so that you're coming in with the same mindset.
I would suggest like letting people know that you really want everyone kind of at their optimal performance level. And so to do this, we know that there are certain things that can help us. So we're all going to get the most out of this particular day. Maybe we're not going to, you only will have access to your phone at certain times. We want phones to be off, or we want to make sure if everyone's going to be on laptops, because maybe you're all working on a project together, we want to make sure that there's no notification popping up or like you're not checking your email, but explaining what it is that you expect, but then also the reason why. Because if people feel like it's just you as a supervisor, kind of like, oh, this is what you're going to do, it feels very like punitive and condescending. But if you give that reason why, people are going to want to participate, because if they're truly invested in the work that you're doing, they don't want to be pulled out of that. They want to be involved. And so just kind of letting them know the different things, like the shared goals and then the reason why, because then we're all working on the same purpose together. And that's going to help us all be on the same page mentally.
I love that. And I wanted to add too on the distractions note that's relevant to group flow and then individually. One of the takeaways from my work with you has been adding to my schedule a window of time, like 3 to 3:15 in the day where I'm going to check notifications. But outside of that, like deleting even my Instagram, my LinkedIn app, like the various apps that are pinging me besides my like Basecamp pings for work, but other like outside distractions that interrupt flow. I actually delete those in the morning and then re-download them in that window of time from 3 to 3:15 if I do want to check them. And it's really been transformative to be able to acknowledge the reality of the fact that all of those pings and all of those alerts coming in every day, it is interrupting my flow. And with the desire to get into that deep, productive, focused state, that's been one thing that has been really helpful. And it sounds kind of extreme in some way, or maybe just it's like a starting point. But when you consider what are the reasons that a lot of us in our modern world are living in that struggle phase, I think just text messages flying in, all the alerts, your Apple Watch going off, all the different things, your mind can feel, more swirly. It's a challenge that I don't hear people talking about enough, but I think it is actually an issue, to be addressed.
Yeah.
That you personally have to just take ownership of. And what I love about what you're saying is manage others' expectations as well. So to be able to say, hey, for the next 2 hours, I'll be doing some deep thinking and doing what my brain is meant to do. So being able to just communicate has been a helpful thing for me, just so that people don't expect an instant response. Now for work, of course, there's expectations. I run sales, business development. So I need to be like responding quickly. But as far as other people and other internal, not urgent communication, some of those expectations can be managed. So
this is like a real discipline that you have to take on every single day and guard it. You have to put a moat around your brain. It's like you got to guard the gates, because I found myself doing that yesterday, and you just feel gross after. Like you're scrolling, you're pretty much just like giving into any sound ping thing that comes in. It's just, it just makes you feel like garbage. And you can feel the difference. You got to guard the gates. Dr. Melanie, I love the conversation about flow. I think that is a topic that is super fascinating. How would people that are listening learn more about it? Flow state, but also just burnout in general. Where could you point them?
So Christina Maslock, the lead researcher on burnout, has a bunch of great books available. And so just kind of depending on which part of burnout you're struggling with, you could, choose any one of her titles because she kind of goes in different areas depending on where you're really struggling. So I would suggest you, looking into her titles. And then as far as flow, the founder of Flow is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He founded the concept. He created it back in 1990. So there's some great books that start with him, but then you'll also see other people who have kind of built upon his work. I personally love Stephen Kotler's book called The Art of Impossible. He talks about flow is like a huge part of the book, even though it's not in it, the title, it's more about peak performance. But he really goes into how to implement the concepts in your life so that you can be at optimal performance.
So helpful. And Dr. Melanie, in our description for this episode, we will have your LinkedIn linked there. And of course, as I said at the beginning, you're a brain coach. You work with teams and also executives. And the nature of this conversation will be, of course, focused more on the executives, but so many ways that you add value across the board. And just want to say, we're grateful for your time and for your investment in our audience, just pouring this really game-changing information into us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I hope, it's a big concept. I hope it's not overwhelming for anyone as far as, because it is so big and broad. So if anyone has any questions, you can all email me or, contact me via LinkedIn.
Great. Well, thanks again.